Our gospel lesson this morning comes from the book of Mark, chapter 12. Begins in verse 38 and ends in verse 44. Jesus also taught, Beware of these teachers of religious law, for they like to parade around in flowing robes and receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honor in the synagogues and the head table at banquets. Yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property, and then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, they will be more severely punished. Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I tell you the truth. This poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions. For they gave a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Now there are some parallels in those two. In our Old Testament lesson and our gospel lesson this morning, we see a poor widow who is down to her last 2 cents, if you will, her last bit of bread. And yet she chooses to give it all. Let's start with just a little history. Widows were not the honorable in that society. Widows did not have high status. In those days, a woman whose husband died could not just go get a job to support her family. A widow relied on the generosity of the community in order to live, in order to feed herself and her family and her children. And yet, in both of the scripture readings this morning, we find that the widow in each story was the generous one. In the passage from 1 Kings, the widow gives Elijah her last bit of bread when she barely has enough for a pitiful last meal. She gives it away. She gives even that in the service of God. And in the passage from Mark, the widow drops 2 small coins into the offering box. And we don't know for sure, but this was likely her last bit of money. And she likely did not draw attention to herself. In fact, she probably attempted to drop them in the box when she thought no one was looking. But Jesus noticed. Jesus noticed her. Jesus points out this tremendous act of generosity to his disciples. He contrasts this poor widow who is generous with the religious leaders, the teachers of religious law, who exploited the poor in order to fill the storehouses of the synagogue. So that floor is creaking right there. I'm going to step down here. The religious leaders loved their high status. They used big words and made long public prayers so that other men would respect and revere them. They loved attention. They put on the facade of piousness. There's some big words for you. In other words, they pretended to be holy so that other people would respect them. They pretended to be righteous and upstanding citizens, but in secret, they used the societal system that they were a part of to get as much money as they could from those who were disadvantaged. They cheated widows out of their property, Jesus said. But the poor widow dropped in her 2 coins. And we don't know the exact value of those 2 coins, but they were the lowest valued coin that they had. To us, 2 pennies. It was the lowest denomination of coin that they had in that day. And what makes it even worse is that the religious leaders were likely to simply waste what little money she had put in. But she didn't know that. Probably. She may not have been aware of it. All she knew was that this is what she had. And she chose to give that to the glory of God. But Jesus knew what was happening. Jesus was aware of what was going on. Jesus could see the injustices all around him. And he pointed that out to other people. He brought it to their attention. He called the disciples over and said, look what has happened. She has been generous. So, where do you see yourself in this story? Think about that for just a moment. Are you the widow? Or are you the other churchgoers? Have you given everything you have to God? Or have you given some of what you have? Have you given a portion of your life, your resources, to God? Stay here. Be quiet, buddy. Have you given a portion to God? Or have you given until it hurts? Do you give quietly, simply, faithfully? Or do you make a production out of your giving? Do you get one of those big giant checks and donate to a charity and have your picture taken for the front page of the paper? No, that's okay. But is that why you're giving? Is it for the attention? Or instead, would everyone you know be surprised to learn how much you actually give? Are you one of the teachers of religious law in the story? Now, none of us thinks that that's who we are, because those were the bad guys. Now, they're not really bad guys because they taught the religious law. They were the preachers, the teachers, the Sunday school teachers, if you will. But they're the bad guys in this story. And you have to be honest. Why do you do the things that you do? Why do you give to the church? Why do you give to other charitable organizations? Is it to prove that to yourself that you're a good person? Is it for a tax break? Is it for the glory of God? Do you act like a Christian all week long or just on Sunday mornings? The teachers of religious law probably followed the law to a T. They probably exercised every facet of the law. They probably followed the law exactly. And in fact, that's probably what Jesus meant when he said they cheated widows out of their property. They probably used the very law that they taught others to follow to require certain things of the widows who now had no other way to get income. They followed the law to a T instead of exercising mercy and kindness and making allowances for those widows who were just trying to make ends meet. Are you one of the disciples? Are you simply going about your everyday business? In the story it says that Jesus called his disciples to him. I have to wonder, what were they doing? They were following Jesus to learn from him, but they're not watching the same things he's watching. He has to call them over and say, hey, look at what she's done. Are you one of the disciples? Are you going about your everyday business just wondering what all this is about? Wondering what Jesus is going to say next? Or are you Jesus? Are you paying attention? Do you see injustice in the world? Do you see oppression? And more importantly, are you trying to do something to help? Who in this story should we model our behavior after? Jesus. In church, the answer is usually Jesus or God. But the interesting thing is that Jesus calls his disciples over and he points to the widow. This is the one who has given the most, Jesus says. She did not make a big deal about dumping her coins into the donation box. She did it quietly. And she didn't just give a little of what she had. She gave everything that she had. Now, I didn't actually mean for this to end up being a sermon about giving. Really, it's more about the attitude behind the giving of the widow in the story. But I think that it's easy for us to understand that attitude in the context of financial gifts. Because money is something that we all understand. We deal with it on a daily basis. And I think that's probably why Jesus talked about money so much. You may have heard the story of Robert Gilmore Latorno. And I'm not going to try to pronounce that last name over and over. I'm just going to call him RG, like most people did. But he was an American businessman in the early 1900s. He dropped out of school and began working in an iron foundry at the age of 14. That was the year 1901. After numerous tradesmen's jobs, he discovered a passion for machinery. As a matter of fact, he ended up having roughly 300 patents for machines and machine parts that he invented. In 1915, at the age of 28, he returned from a period of service with the Navy in World War I. And he returned to a car dealership which he had part ownership of that was steeped in debt. RG was able to remove himself from the business with roughly $5,000 in personal debt in 1915. He jumped at the chance to make a little money by leveling some land for a wealthy rancher. And he enjoyed it so much that he began to take more and more larger and larger construction jobs for leveling land. And then he got into road construction. And at the time, roads were built by employing large numbers of men with shovels and then utilizing mules to drag small plows. RG was among the first road construction contractors to introduce machinery to moving earth. He continually underbid his competitors to win jobs, and then he would scramble and invent machines in order to speed up the work so that he wouldn't lose money. And as a Christian, he felt the tug to be doing more for God. He went to his pastor for advice because he thought that to be wholly committed to God meant that you had to become a pastor, you had to go to seminary. You had to preach. But he was surprised to hear that his pastor's advice was, no, God needs businessmen too. That was a revelation to him. And from that day forward, he began to consider God his business partner. But unfortunately, that didn't mean that everything went right from that day forward. In 1927, a big construction job went bad and put him $100,000 in debt. That was 1927. Just 2 years later, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. It's not exactly the best time to be deep in debt, wondering how to feed your family. And now, for years, when money got tight, RG would take the machinery that he had invented and built for himself to help with his construction jobs, and he would sell it off to others in order to make a little money and make ends meet. Road construction was what he did best, but jobs were more and more difficult to come by. So on the advice of his lawyer, he decided instead to manufacture and sell the machines that he had invented. This was the turning point for him. In 1932, his company had a net profit of $52,055 and some change. By 1938, the net profit for the year was $1,412,465. But 3 years prior to that, in 1935, RG and his wife decided to increase their giving, to increase their charitable giving to 90% of their income. Rather than tithing, rather than doing the traditional 10%, they flipped it. They kept the 10% to live off of, and they gave away 90% of their income. RG liked to say that the question is not how much of my money can I give to God, but how much of God's money am I going to keep for myself. Now, to be fair, they kept and lived off of just over $141,000, which is plenty to live on, in my opinion. Today, it was certainly plenty to live on in 1938. But that means that they gave away $1.2 billion just that year. That's astonishing to think of. They gave away $1.2 billion of their own money, their take-home pay. Now, I'm not saying that you should be giving away 90% of your income. That is not what I'm advocating. But I do want you to consider that question. How much of your time, your talents, your resources is enough? Can you give too much? Can you outgive God? Are you asking the question, how much of my money, how much of my time, how much of my talents should I give God? Or instead, are you asking the question, how much of the time, the talents, the resources that God has given me should I keep for myself? Let us pray.